jokes about you, Jamie?
Yeah, lay off the third grade math stuff, will you, Steve?
Fair enough.
Okay. All right, buddy, your turn.
All right. So before I actually get in and demo the software, typically what I do is to just give kind of a short history of the product. And though generally I think histories of product are kind of a waste of time, in this case I think it kind of lays the context for how the product was developed, which just makes the demo have some context and makes it a little bit easier to understand. So about 3 years ago, we were asked to develop a prenatal module for Allscripts. One of our clients had evaluated the Allscripts one and decided it just wasn't a particularly good fit for them. And so they asked us to come in and work with them to develop what I'm going to show you today. As part of that process, we sat down every week with a group of about 10 to 15 OBGYNs who gave us input on what it is that they would want to see as clinicians and how we could really make the application work for them. So to start with, they said, let's start with the industry standard ACOG form, the paper copy. And we need to take all of the data that would typically be on that paper copy and somehow represent it electronically and as part of the TouchWorks product. Once we did that, we spent the rest of the time going through and figuring out how to make the application as easy to use as possible and as user-friendly as possible so that the clinicians could get in, chart what they needed to, and get out. Mm-hmm. So if you look at a paper ACOG, a lot of what you see on that paper ACOG already exists in the chart. Lab results, allergies, medications, problems, things of that nature. And so we pull those into the ACOG automatically from the chart so that clinicians don't have to double enter that. We pull it in, though, so that they can actually see that full ACOG that they're used to seeing with that data without having to flip back and forth between the charts.
Good deal. And what this particular, one of our particular people looking at this was, even though they liked the metainformatics one they're on, there was duplications, like sometimes they had to put in extra lab results or extra diagnoses or extra prescription stuff just because it did not pull everything in. So the fact that you're eliminating dual entry is a huge point.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So what we see on the screen today, right here now, is the ACOG fully integrated into the TouchWorks chart. So, we have a particular patient up, Christine Test, and you can see just as a tab within the chart, the application here. If you were to compare that to some of the other prenatal modules, like, for example, the Allscripts one, with the Allscripts one, when you click Prenatal to launch it, it actually launches a second window. And so you have to flip back and forth between the chart and the prenatal module to do your charting. Here we've integrated it directly into the chart so that there's no need to flip windows back and forth. So what I see here is I see a single pregnancy for Christine Test. If she had had multiple pregnancies, we'd have multiple rows listed here. I'm going to go ahead and go in and view this existing ACOG. I could, similarly, I could click New ACOG, which would generate a brand new one. But today we're going to work with an existing one. I'll also point out that this is just my development system where I've disabled some saving back to the database and things like that. So right now we're only going to see the form, but it's not going to be populated with data. So when we come into the form, you'll see that there are 6 tabs up top, and these mirror the forms on the ACOG. So history mirrors Form A, initial physical exam is Form B, Form C, Form D, Form E, and Form G. right? When we go into Form A, which we're in right now, there's some usability features, like the ability to collapse all the sections so you can easily get to any one particular section that you need to get to. The ability to expand them all or to expand and contract any particular one. If we look at the fields that are in some of these sections, like general information, for example, hospital of delivery, that's not something that's going to show up in the chart. And so that's a read-write field here, right? And so I can go in and I can say, if I could type some hospital, right? And I can put it in and enter it, and that's going to be saved as part of the chart. If we go down a little bit, you look and you'll see all of these fields pretty closely mirror what you see on an ACOG. When we get to medical history, these are grayed out, right? So, if the patient had a history of cancer, it should be charted in the chart. And if it was charted, we catch it here, right? So we don't allow you to say that the patient had cancer in the ACOG because that really shouldn't live just in the ACOG. It should live in the chart. There was a decision when we built this right up front that this was going to be a one-way flow of data from the chart to the prenatal module. And that was a decision made by the clinicians. They said, we want to chart the same way that we chart today, and we don't want to have to go to two different places to potentially chart the same thing and have two different workflows.
I agree. This should all be done up front, going through normal medical history. Some people may ask, well, I'd like to do it here, but no, I agree with your decision. That should, all these things should come through the normal channels.
Mm-hmm. So the out-of-the-box product is a one-way flow from Allscripts into the prenatal module. If there's a need for things to go back the other way bidirectionally, technologically there's nothing stopping us. And if that's something that a particular client wants to do, we can work with them to do that. But the out-of-the-box configuration is one way. The only thing that does go back to the chart is the filled-out ACOG itself. So if we're looking at, for example, medical history, something like cancer here, I can't just say, oh, my patient has cancer and diagnose it here. That's got to come in from the chart. When we get into things like the genetic screening, here they're all read-write. And even though, if we had a history of Down syndrome on the mother, this would be checked, right? But we don't have access to or information about the father's genetic screening or genetic history. And so we need to allow for the ability that any one of these could be checked even though we have no knowledge of it from the mother's chart. Similarly, we have infection history, things like a history of STDs, history of HIV. Those are all going to be in the chart as well. And then immunizations, obviously those are going to come over with the date if they exist. When we flip to the physical exam, on the physical exam we have the date of the physical exam. By default, it's going to pick up the first encounter after the LMP. Now, it's always possible that you got a cold. 7 days after your LMP, you come in and the first encounter after your LMP isn't really the initial prenatal exam. So if you change the date that comes across that we automatically match to, it'll automatically re-pull the vitals to match the date that you put in. You can go in and do the initial physical exam as normal. If everything's normal, you can click Check All Normal, and that saves you having to click Normal, 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 Normal on all of them. Similarly, you can come in and add a comment. You can add as many comments as you want, throughout the course of the pregnancy. We flip to Form C. We have kind of some common and important information up here in the general information. Drug allergy and latex allergy are going to automatically come over. You can see that the problems automatically came over. A couple things that you can do. For one, as an example, health maintenance isn't really relevant to this pregnancy, let's say. So I can say, yeah, I don't really want to see that problem. That's not really relevant. You can also say, well, this abdominal pain isn't relevant either, and hide it. But then maybe you say, oops, I didn't really mean to click to hide that abdominal pain. So I can always come back and add something that I've hidden and show it again. Similarly, you can decide something like diabetes, for example, is really important, and you can reorder the list to order the most important problems, to the top so that you make sure that you see them. Finally, I can add problems which do not go back to the chart problem. And the idea would be here that sometimes there are problems that really aren't, kind of health problems that the chart needs to know about or that need to be, tracked by any physician, but are very specific to the pregnancy itself and aren't really clinical things. So the examples might be, this baby is going to be given up for adoption, or, do not tell the parents the sex of the baby. Things that you want to track and you want to be aware of and, that need to be kind of in the clinician's face, but that aren't really relevant to providing health care for that particular patient. If we come down to the EDD confirmation and 18 to 20-week EDD update, a lot of the information on the chart is driven off of this section. So we said we pull in a lot of data. Probably roughly half the chart, roughly half the ACOG comes from the chart. And some of it is not time dependent. If you have a problem and it's an active problem, we're going to bring it in. If you have a medication and it's an active medication, we're going to bring it in. It doesn't matter if it was prescribed 3 years ago. Other things like, for example, a CBC. If I had a CBC 10 years ago, not really relevant to this pregnancy. And so some of them are date dependent. How we determine for date-dependent things whether they should come in is based off the LMP and the final EDD. When you first create the ACOG, you're asked to give it an LMP. That LMP is going to be available in a list of LMPs that were entered in the vitals. And so you're going to choose an LMP from that list. When you choose an LMP, it's going to automatically generate the final EDD based off of that LMP. That's going to drive the date range and the dates for which things are going to come in. You can, however, come in and say, well, I did an initial exam later, and I'd like to revise the EDD. Or I did an ultrasound, and based on the ultrasound, I could see that the EDD is actually a little bit off. So you can track the fact that I have different methods by which the EDD was calculated. And then down in the final EDD, you can choose which method you're going to use as your source of truth. If you change your source of truth, and that ends up changing the date, then all of the data associated with this pregnancy will get re-pulled. So, if tests have fallen out of range and then fall in range because of that, you'll see them the next time you come into the ACOG. Or if you click refresh, they'll come in automatically at that point. Below that, you see the encounter list. This gets populated with any encounters after the LMP. And while the ACOG is still open and there's a final date, I want to say, the EDD plus maybe 2 months. I could look up how far out it'll actually go. It doesn't go off, ad infinitum. We're going to pull in any encounters and populate the gestational date and the blood pressure and weight and all of the vitals that were associated with that. Things like fundal height and whatnot, you're going to potentially measure for each encounter. These columns all mirror what you see on an ACOG. And then finally, at the bottom of Form C, we have comments again.
This is where they would go for all the subsequential visits after the first one, and they'd be filling out rows there.
Correct. Yeah, that would show up in the encounter grid. And as encounters show up, it's just going to automatically plug in more rows to accommodate that.
Cool.
When we flip over to test results, we can see that the test results are kind of grouped by where they occur throughout the pregnancy. So you have things like initial labs that we're going to do right up front. And you can see, for example, there's a CBC that we're going to do right at the start of the pregnancy. You can also see that later on we're going to do a CBC again. And down here we're going to do one more CBC, right? And the way that we know where a particular result should show up, whether it goes into initial or 24 to 28 or 32 to 36 weeks, is based off that LMP and final EDD. We pull across all of these lab results, and they populate this form. The way that we do that is specifically for lab results, they're based off of LOINC code, and we allow you to map at one of two levels. You can either map at the dictionary ID level and say that, you know, within my Allscripts dictionaries, I have these IDs that tie to a CBC, or you can map things at the LOINC code level, and you can say the LOINC code that we have in our dictionary for CBC is 12345-1. And then we'll go look up all the dictionary IDs associated with that LOINC code and then do the mapping based off of that.
I got you. And what if a particular lab result that should have made it into one of these 4-week windows didn't hit the chart quite in time, or it came in early, or it came in late? I see that these boxes are white. Does that give you the ability to enter those by hand if needed?
You could enter them by hand. What we actually do is the lab is supposed to be done between 32 and 36 weeks. But what we will do is we actually go back, I want to say, from 30 to 38. So we give you a little leeway on either side to accommodate a lab that might have been done a little bit early, just because, you know, if somebody had an appointment at 31 weeks and 4 days, you know, you're probably just going to do whatever, you know, the CDC at that point because they're in the office and there. So we'll look back a little bit and look forward a little bit as well. And then similarly to mapping on the LOINC code level, as I mentioned for labs, for problems, we'll also allow you to map by ICD-9 code or ICD-10 if you have that filled out in your dictionary. Moving on to patient education. Patient education is broken up into the various trimesters. You can come in, you can say, I've done the education related to this one particular item, or if you sit down and do all of them, you can say, just check them all. Finally, progress notes. I can type a lot of stuff here, ... and I am just going to paste and paste and paste and paste, 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 paste. And that box, oops, apparently I selected it all. That box just kind of keeps getting bigger as I type and accommodates whatever my note is. When I'm all done, I click Generate. That Generate is going to take all of the information here in the ACOG and put it into a PDF copy of the ACOG and drop that into the chart. So if I come back into the desktop, you can see that I've got my one ACOG here, right? And I can open it up, and it's just a document like any other document. A couple, or at least one really nice thing about the ACOG that we generate is imagine that you were building a paper ACOG, right? And somebody was going to order this, and you're going to print it up, and then they were just going to work with this piece of paper. Well, you have a lot of things throughout a pregnancy that might repeat, as an example. So I might have encounters. Well, how many encounters am I going to actually have during this pregnancy? Well, you know, sometimes maybe it's going to be 6, and sometimes maybe it's going to be 22, and, you know, you don't really know in advance. And so when you're building a paper ACOG, you have to put in kind of enough rows that you think you're going to get most of them, but not so many rows that you have 18 pages of encounter rows, only a fraction of which are being used. And the reason you have to do things like that is you don't know what data is going to be in the ACOG when it's actually used. For us, we're actually dynamically generating the ACOG on the fly. So we know exactly how much data is going to go into this ACOG at the point that we generate it. So if there's 3 encounters at this point in the pregnancy, we generate 3 encounter rows. If there's 22, we generate 22 encounter rows. If you don't type any comments, we don't leave an empty page for comments. If you type 6 pages of comments, you get 6 pages of comments. So we can size the ACOG so that you don't have a bunch of empty area that's just dedicated to placeholding for where data might go. So going back into the application itself, I'm going to just throw out a couple features that aren't necessarily immediately obvious. One is this application auto-saves your work every 15 seconds. Now, in my little development copy, you're going to see something pop up right there. Just says I disabled the auto-save. But every 15 seconds, this saves your work. What that means is that absolutely no matter what, you can never lose more than 15 seconds of work.
That's awesome.
If you know you're sitting here charting and you've been working on something for 10 minutes and the power goes out or you spill your coffee on your computer, you didn't lose more than 15 seconds worth of data. We keep the save button here because people just feel good about clicking save and it makes them feel comfortable and happy. But in essence, it's really kind of unnecessary. Second of all, we have a full audit trail on every field. So when you come in and you say, you know, oh, wait a minute, I set the hospital of delivery to hospital A and it says hospital B. How did that get to be there? You can go in and you can look at, I believe it's Control H, if I'm not mistaken, and it'll pop up a little audit trail of every change to that field and who changed it and when. So you can find out how a field got changed, why, and by who. Finally, one of the things that was kind of a source of frustration for the physicians we work with was the contention model in all scripts. And the idea is this. You have a nurse and you have a physician, and they're both working in the same record. And the nurse saves her work, and the physician goes to save their work, and it says, well, somebody's made some changes here. We can't save your record. Just go ahead and re-enter it, and we'll save it. And you have all of that lost data. They have to go redo it. So they asked us to figure out a way to make that process easier. What we did is we came up with something called field-level contention. The idea is this. Imagine you have 10 fields. The nurse goes into a prenatal record for a particular patient. A provider goes into a record for a particular patient. The nurse enters fields 1 to 5. And the provider changes fields 6 to 10. When the nurse saves, we expect her save to go through, and it does. When the provider goes to save, it recognizes the fact that none of the fields that the provider changed conflict with the fields that the nurse changed, and so it goes in. And neither of them is any the wiser that they were both in the same record. If you look at the scenario where the nurse goes in and enters fields 1 to 6, and the provider enters fields 6 to 10, the nurse saves, and that's going to go in as expected. When the provider goes to save, they have that field of contention on field 6. Now, in many applications, it just says, oh, sorry, you got to re-enter fields 6 to 10. You got to redo everything because somebody else saved in the meantime. What we do is we recognize that the only overlapping field was field 6. We say, don't worry, you're not going to lose anything. The nurse entered field 6 as A. You entered it as B. Which one do you want to use? They choose whether they want to use A or B, and then the save goes through with all of their data. If, let's say, they had overlapped on 6 or 7 fields, excuse me, they get a list of those 6 or 7 fields that they can choose field by field which value that they want to use. Or they can say, use all of mine or use all of theirs. They click Save, everything gets committed, and they don't lose any work. And that is the prenatal application.
That's phenomenal. I'm very impressed.